It's also a real good pleasure to be here talking about something that I'm really, really passionate about, which is trauma-informed practices. And I'm really buoyed to see that there's so much interest in this topic, because I think it is the singular most important topic that we can be working towards building in our practice in the current environment that we live in. Just a little bit about me. So my name is Emma. I'm obviously from the UK. I've got 4 boys, as I just said, they're there. And that is part of the reason that I'm really intrigued and inspired and passionate about this topic, because what I want to do is create a legacy for a society that enables my boys to flourish and fulfill their potential. And I think if we move towards a trauma-informed society, that is one thing that we can be doing to support all of our children, all of our tamariki, to flourish, irrespective of what the future holds for them. So I am a child psychologist. I am the Director of Psychological Services for the Child Psychology Service. We're a nationwide service that provides support to children, young people and their families. I'm also the Clinical Director at the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience, and I work with Denise Quinlan and Lucy Hone. Before I was working independently, I was practice leader for the intensive wraparound service at the Ministry of Education. But in the UK, before I practiced as a psychologist, I was a social worker. And that was where I really kind of started to develop an interest in trauma, and how trauma not just impacts a person as it exists, but how the ramifications of trauma can leave ripples and effects throughout a person's entire lifetime. So as we go through today, I just wanted to touch on some housekeeping, because I think it's really important that when we talk about trauma, it means lots of different things to different people. We all have a story, we all have a childhood, we all have experiences that challenge us. So just want to think, especially when we're going to the breakout rooms, respect each other and be aware that we all have different experiences, cultures and lenses through which we view the world. I am notorious for trying to squad too much information in too short a time. So please do make links to your own practice, because you are the experts in your own context. You know what you do, and you know how you do it much more than I do. So be the bridge from what I'm sharing to what you're doing, and stay comfortable. Trauma is a triggering topic. It can be a triggering topic. So if at any time that I'm talking through something, there's nothing hugely contentious today, but things affect different people differently. Makes you feel uncomfortable, hold your chest, take a deep breath, remind yourself you're safe. So we're going to go through 3 basic kind of areas. We're going to look at why focus on trauma. We're going to look at the realization and recognition of trauma, and then we're going to look at what we can do in practical terms as leaders to move towards a more trauma-informed society. So the first question, I guess, is why focus on trauma at all? It's a big buzz topic, and I've just explained to you that I'm really passionate about it because of my background and my kids, and thinking that this is the best way that we can provide the best future for all of humanity. Big kind of manifesto, I know. But it is a big topic at the moment. We do seem to be talking about it a lot. So why focus on trauma? And we're going to look at the impact of trauma, then we're going to look at trauma-informed practice, and then you're going to go into breakout rooms to have a little chat about that. So for me, I think the reason that we should be focusing on trauma is that we haven't been getting it right. We have essentially been waiting until we are children and young people and adults and whānau get to the point where they're in a lot of distress and we're seeing poor outcomes. And we've been kind of tailoring services that they hit kind of that pink circle there. And I think what we need to be doing is orienting our service structures and our system so we capture people before their distress gets too high, before the situations that they are involved in become really overwhelming, and also build and strengthen society so situations don't become overwhelming in the first instance. And I think what we also need to be doing is taking note from people who have had resilient outcomes in spite of extreme adversity, and think about the opportunity structures that are in place that have supported them to do so. So I think we all have some kind of part to play in making sure that we can reorientate the system to be able to get everybody the support they need in the first instance before their distress gets so high that they're actually having poor outcomes. We do know that the impact of trauma is the leading preventable risk factor for mental health, illness, substance abuse and offending. So irrespective of whether you come from a humanitarian perspective or an economic perspective, having a trauma-informed approach is hugely, hugely valuable. Maltreatment and trauma in childhood, specifically, so developmental trauma, is responsible for up to 45% of mental health issues. And 6 to 8% of children in New Zealand experience severe maltreatment. Now, I think that's underreported. And then there's something called latent vulnerability. So irrespective of you potentially having adversity in your childhood and looking like you're resilient and getting through life, what happens is people who've experienced early adversity have a higher tendency to struggle with mental health issues later on in life, something called latent vulnerability. Trauma impacts the way that we relate and connect with others, and we're social creatures, and connection is one of our key needs. And experiencing trauma, especially relational trauma or developmental trauma, inhibits our trust in connections with others, which robs us of something that gives us vitality and enables us to flourish. And the other thing to think about is that trauma spans generations. So over time, the effects of unhealed trauma can start to look like somebody's personality. The way they show up in the world because of the experiences that they had can shape the way that they interact with others, and it can be assumed to be their personality. And if left unaddressed and passed around through generations, it can start to look like culture. And I truly do believe that a lot of the dysfunction that we see in society today is largely due to trauma responses or avoiding trauma or avoiding our responses, our internal responses to trauma. Now, the other thing to remember is that human beings do not exist in a vacuum. And, you know, when we're thinking about addressing trauma, even if you don't have your own story, even if you don't work with people who particularly have experienced adversity and everyone seems to be rubbing along quite nicely, we need to remember that mental health is a way of being that has collective consequences, and these collective consequences have an effect on the environment, and the environment affects our behavior. So, you know, if we're not doing it for ourselves, it's important that we do it for others. It's important that we show up and we move towards a trauma-informed approach in society to make sure that we can support and protect the mental health of everybody, not just people, but also communities, cultures, and society as a whole. Now, given our unique kind of bicultural lens that we have living in Aotearoa, it's really important that we think about cultural safety, and we use a KAUPAPA Māori trauma-informed framework, because there are very specific areas of trauma that are relevant to colonised Indigenous people, and specifically relevant to Māori, and that's situational trauma due to being dissociated from immediate and extended whānau and their culture or wairua. There's cumulative trauma, so subtle feelings that build up over time due to experiences of racism and discrimination, and intergenerational and historic trauma, so being indoctrinated negatively about being Indigenous, and Indigenous people experiencing trauma through colonisation, dispossession and dislocation, as well as the trauma of ongoing violence and other events in which the effects of this are indisputably unacceptable, actually. So when we are talking about a trauma-informed society, when we're talking about what trauma-informed approaches mean, it's really important that you know the culture and the context that you work in, and you make sure that the framework that you're using suits your organisation and the people within that system. Culturally safe trauma-informed approaches that are cognizant of a Māori worldview and cultural experience for both Māori clients and a Māori workforce are pivotal. So, why focus on trauma? Because we have no idea what any particular individual's experiences or responses are, or what their responses to those experiences might be. So we need to be aware of the overall impact that trauma may have and develop a trauma-informed approach to our work. Now, for me, it's just basic common sense. Trauma-informed approaches are both human-centric and nervous system friendly. You know, there's no kind of great shakes here. It just means creating a society that is fit for human flourishing. Having a trauma-informed approach suits everybody and detracts from no one. So it's absolutely unfathomable why we wouldn't want to move in this direction anyway. It's about making society fit humans rather than humans trying to fit society. So that's why we should focus on trauma. But what does trauma-informed practice actually look like? So when you're thinking about trauma-informed practice, it's really helpful to break it down into what's known as the 4 R's, and it's guided by 4 basic assumptions. So realization about trauma, the prevalence of trauma and how it can affect people in groups. And that's kind of understanding, you know, trauma is far-reaching and it's often sometimes not the things that we think it might be, and we're going to talk about that just shortly. Recognizing the signs of trauma, what this looks like and how it can present. We're going to talk about that shortly too. How that is important in the context that you work in. Responsiveness to trauma, so how to support healing and growth for ourselves and for others, for the betterment of humanity. And also, how do we resist re-traumatization? What is it about our systems and processes that can actually mimic and mirror some of the experiences that have caused trauma in the first instance? And one of the most obvious ones of those is kind of exclusion with children with abandonment issues. So how do we think about how we resist re-traumatization in our work? So essentially, the underlying principles is that trauma-informed approach is a strengths-based model of service delivery which focuses on individual strengths and competencies. So it's looking at what's right with a person, not focusing on what's wrong with a person. A trauma-informed approach believes that people can and will recover from trauma, and we must support their determination and resilience to do so. And the point is to reduce distress, and enable potential. And the sad fact is that we are losing so much human potential to the impact of trauma. We are losing poets, we are losing artists, we are losing scientists, we are losing novelists. We are losing so much human being potential to the impact of distress and trauma. So if we move towards a more trauma-informed society, we're going to be able to harness a lot of that potential. And I'll tell you what, going forward into the future, we need a lot of that potential to overcome and face some of the really big challenges that we collectively face. So a framework for me, for the work, put simply, is that if you show up and you respect yourself and the other person as sacred, as valid, as whole, not for any other reason, but they are a human being. They have a sense of central validity for just existing. You work in a way that builds rather than diminishes mana. You act with integrity, honesty, and love in most of your interactions. You help yourself and others make peace with what's gone before, so you can look forward and reflect on the kind of So there's a lot of information that I've shared there, and these slides are taken from 2 days training that I've tried to squash down together. And it could feel really overwhelming, I think, to kind of think about, okay, that all sounds really wonderful. And, you know, yeah, we can see that there's a lot of stuff going on, and we can see the impact of trauma is quite far reaching, and we can see that it spans generations. And actually, when you start thinking about it and trying to unpick it too much, it becomes like, it can start to feel really overwhelming. And I guess for me, moving towards trauma-informed approaches is a bit of a movement. It's what do we do? How do we all together collectively show up differently in a way that values human beings rather than diminishes human beings? And we need to remember that, you know, even though that can feel quite overwhelming, even the biggest waves are made up of the smallest molecules, and they just all happen moving in the same direction at the same time. So to help you kind of key into what it is that you might be able to do, I just want you to have a wee think about where you think your role and your influence may be. Because if you think about the things that matter and the things that are within or outside of your control, you know, there's lots of things that matter and there's lots of things that are outside of your control. But the important thing is to kind of focus on the confluence between the two. So things that matter and things that are within your control. So I would like you to have a wee think when you go out into breakout rooms just shortly on where you think your role and influence is. So that might be this is set up for a school, you know, a trauma-aware teacher in a trauma-sensitive classroom, in a trauma-responsive school, in a trauma-informed community. So a trauma-aware teacher might be able to recognise that some behaviours might be because of experiences that a child has had outside of school and brings in and deals with those in a supportive rather than punitive way. A trauma-sensitive classroom might be one that's set up to not be too much of sensory overload and kind of follow a pace and a pattern that kind of supports a child feeling safe in their learning. A trauma-responsive school would be one that had policies that kind of looked at, you know, how do we include and support children and young people and our staff and their well-being in relation to their experiences prior and outside of school. And a trauma-informed community, what could that look like? So I just want you, when you go out into breakout rooms now, to have a think, where do you think your role and influence lies? If we're asking you to come together and think about trauma-informed approaches, strengths-based model of service delivery, and things that matter and things that are within your control, where is your role and influence when you're moving towards a trauma-informed practice? Before the break, we kind of just went and had a chat about, you know, where's your role and influence, because it can feel really overwhelming. And I kind of want to, you know, share some information. I want to kind of really locate you into what you can do rather than be overwhelmed by what you can't do or what you might not be able to get to yet. So we're going to talk about the next R of trauma now. We're going to look at the realisation of trauma. So what it is and how does it happen? So there are several types of trauma. They're not mutually exclusive. There's single incidence trauma. And I'm sure if I asked you to, you could reflect on something that you might be able to put under that. And there's complex and repetitive trauma. There's historical, collective or intergenerational trauma, which we just touched on from a Māori perspective. There's secondary and vicarious trauma, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this because this is really, really prevalent in the helping professions. You know, so if you are a leader in charge of people, if you're a teacher in a school, if you work with children and young people, if your business is other people's business, you are going to be at risk for secondary or vicarious trauma if you don't protect yourself and if you're not aware about it. And that is because we have mirror neurons, we're wired for connection, and we feel each other's feels. And so we just need to be very careful of that and notice when we're feeling topped out and have some strategies that I'm going to talk about later to put into practice when we're beginning to feel a little bit raw and jangled. And then there's little t trauma. So these are smaller but significant events that impact our sense of the world as a safe place. And it's quite often, if you think about somebody who's experienced quite complex and repetitive trauma, it's quite often the little t trauma that kind of absolutely pulls the pin and everything else kind of starts tumbling down. So we need to be aware that, you know, something that might not seem big to you in the context of somebody else's experience could be actually quite overwhelming. Now, also, I think, thinking about children and young people and ourselves too, we are living at a very interesting point on the timeline of humanity. I think we're living at somewhat of a perfect storm. You know, we're kind of going through COVID-19. We have the impact of technology and artificial intelligence in our lives, which I think can be a massive opportunity. But I also think that it has a very big risk of disrupting the very things that we need as human beings to flourish if we don't use it well. You know, if you think about our attention and how it's being pulled in several different directions at any given moment by all of the kind of the messages that we get through tech, through our phone, through our emails, it can be very disconnecting and overwhelming. We have modern life. You know, human beings were wired to live in small communities. We weren't wired to live in these kind of nuclear, little separate kind of bubbles. And our nervous systems have not caught up with the way that we live today. And that's inherently unsettling. And then suddenly, you know, in February, somebody decided to go and invade somebody else's country. And actually that, even though it's on the other side of the world, even if you don't have people, you know, you don't have any connection with Ukraine or Russia, it can feel very, very unsettling to know that things like that can just suddenly happen. It's the rug is pulled from under your feet again. And then we have climate change. And so whether you believe that it's anthropogenic or not, that's man-made or not, the facts and the scientific kind of evidence is undisputable and things are shifting. And there are some real big problems, some real big issues that we need to be able to pull together as a human race to collectively solve. And we are unlikely to be able to do that if we are in our kind of threat state, which happens when we're kind of overwhelmed with trauma, if we don't move towards more trauma-informed society that enables us to fulfill our potential and flourish, we're going to miss out on some opportunities to overcome some of these big issues. And we're already seeing in children and young people, specifically the ones that we see in our service and the ones that I work with, a lot of grief, helplessness, overwhelm, resentment, fear, anxiety, demoralization, anger, a sense of resentment at not being given the legacy that they believed that they were going to have as they grew up as children, and their future is feeling bleak and it's going to be different, and a sense of vulnerability, but vulnerability without a sense of inherent protection underneath. Vulnerability is a superpower if you can show up and be vulnerable, but vulnerability when you live in a vulnerable situation or society is threatening. The truth is that existing in the world we live in today is a traumatic experience. Our nervous systems and our brains are not wired for it. And today's children and young people have never known a life outside of these influences. And we need to think about that quite deeply and carefully, because trauma changes the way that our bodies work. I've talked about brains and nervous systems a couple of times already. Trauma affects us at the genetic level in terms of our epigenetics, so it can prime genetic code to switch genes on or off. If you think about autoimmunity, that's one kind of example of that, but I'm not an epigeneticist, so I'm not going to go much more into depth around that. Then it changes the way that our brain shapes and develops. Our brains are amazing machines. They are born into the world and they organize themselves in relation to prioritizing the structures that it thinks it needs to be able to fulfill our survival needs effectively. So if you think about the fact that our brain is there to keep our body alive, and our body is there to keep our brain alive, our brain comes out into the world, assesses the situation that it's born into, and organizes itself in relation to the skills and the abilities that it thinks it needs to facilitate our survival. And then it affects us at the psychological and behavioral level too. And so if you think about what you might see in terms of trauma, if you're looking for trauma, or you're trying to kind of think about what's going on in terms of trauma-informed society, this is where you might see it most. It affects the way that we think, feel, and behave. It affects the way that we show up in the world. Because our brain has been prioritized differently. Our brain has been prioritized for self-protection rather than cooperation and connection. Essentially, our brains have two basic modes. We have avoid mode and approach mode. So approach mode is kind of our reward response system. And that is it kind of builds on our pleasure and satisfaction, and it helps us approach a stimulus. So it gives us a global and creative focus. So when we sit in our approach state of mind, we are able to conceptualize multiple realities. We'll be able to come up with creative solutions to problems. But trauma wires our brain more for an avoid state of mind. We're constantly scanning our environment for threat. It's indicated in our stress response system, and it changes our focus to one that's narrow. Because what it does is when we are under threat, we get a very narrow focus, because what the priority is to hone in on an exit or the safest route away from threat, not stand there thinking about all the other options that are available to us. So if we have a child or a young person, or ourselves even who've experienced an amount of trauma, then we are tending to go towards our avoid state of mind, one that's kind of narrow in focus, and one that's wired for self-protection rather than connection. It impacts the way that we show up in the world. And that changes the way that our nervous system functions. So our nervous system looks a little bit like this weird diagram here, but I'll explain it to you. So essentially, each of us have something called a window of tolerance, and that's the bandwidth within which we function well. And this is dynamic and can change over the course of the day due to a number of things, such as hunger, tiredness, other competing demands. But actually also, if you've experienced a large amount of trauma, a lot of our bandwidth is taken up with scanning our environment for threat. So people who've experienced trauma already have a more narrow window of tolerance. So their bandwidth for things going wrong or needing to be different is very defined. And so typical emotional regulation, so our ability to regulate our emotions, oscillates between our parasympathetic and our sympathetic nervous system throughout the day. So our parasympathetic nervous system is kind of rest and digest, and our sympathetic nervous system is kind of fight, flight, freeze, kind of action. So, and the reason that it oscillates between the two is because we kind of get a sense of urgency, we do something, and then our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, and then we rest and digest, and we kind of move and we rest, and we move and we rest. Now, if we've experienced a large amount of trauma, what happens is that goes out of whack a little bit. And what we're seeing with children and young people who've experienced unsafe situations, or they're feeling like they're not being supported well, or they don't know how to manage their emotions, what happens is they either become hyper aroused, which is kind of where anxiety sits, they don't know how to bring themselves back down again, or they become dissociative, they freeze and dissociate if over time they feel like there's nothing that they can do to regulate their emotions, they can't change their situation. What they do is start tuning out, and they start becoming dissociated and depressed and hopeless. And so that's how trauma and traumatic experiences rewire our brain and our nervous system. So our brain is prioritized for safety and protection rather than curiosity and connection. Essentially, trauma comes from a period of stress and rewires the body and the brain, and it's a biological system shift from a focus on learning to a focus on survival. Now, I think the really important thing to remember is that trauma is not damage. And we talk about people being damaged goods. And when I was a social worker, I'd often read in people's files, very damaged child. Trauma is not damage. We cannot write people off like that. In fact, trauma-based behaviours are simply resilient behaviours needed for a different context. They're survival adaptations from maladaptive environment, and it's an entirely appropriate functional adaptation by the brain in response to that maladaptive environment. Human beings are more than their adverse experiences. And actually, trauma can sometimes make us run really hard and fast, and this might actually sometimes be in the right direction. And I'm sure if I asked you to reflect for a moment, or on your own experiences, there are times when adversity has enabled you to move forward and do things. A lot of people, a lot of leaders, and a lot of people in high power positions have had quite adverse childhoods, and education and kind of achievement has been their mode of operation to be able to escape from those early experiences. So it's not necessarily always a damaging thing. Now, what I would like you to have a think about is this inconvenient truth. Our nervous systems have not evolved to function in the society that we live in today, and the balance is off, so the blueprint needs to change. And I think the real way to address trauma is through societal change, and societal change is a collective community responsibility. It's not something that we rely on our leaders for. It is something that everybody has to do. We have to pull together to do that. We need to move towards a trauma-informed approach, which is an approach that recognises and addresses what traumatizes, and not just one that recognises trauma after the effect. We need to be thinking about meeting that kind of early kind of yellow circle I showed you on the graph earlier, rather than waiting that people are getting in that kind of pink circle when they're kind of poor outcomes. We can't provide certainty for the future. Absolutely, we can't. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, especially with climate change. But what we can do is teach the skills needed to deal with that uncertainty. And we are more likely to be able to manage uncertainty when we are in our approach state of mind rather than our avoid state of mind. And then we can build the resilience and courage to change the focus from one of toxic productivity, which I think society has got hooked up on today, which is not fit for human flourishing. So I would like you to go out into your breakout rooms just now, and while I've been talking, have a think about what's come up for you, what links have you made to your own knowledge, and just note down any actions. Thank you so much, everyone, for bearing with me on the kind of setting the scene. What we're going to be talking about now is recognising and responding to trauma. So what does it look like? And then what do we actually do when we see it? So what can trauma look like? So trauma can look like internalised and externalised. So it can look internalised. So that's kind of somaticization. So that's kind of when kids particularly, they've got a tummy ache in their head or a headache in their knee, they're trying to explain an emotional pain through the medium of their physical being. And actually, a lot of people who haven't learned how to identify what their emotions feel like, because emotions, they start in our brain, but they're felt in our body. And if a lot of people haven't experienced, even in adulthood, how to do that, how to develop their skill of interoception, then what happens is that they can start to pathologize those feelings, and they become kind of a physical manifestation of an emotional feeling. People who've experienced trauma can be overly compliant and agreeable, so the kind of fawn response, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, especially important for leaders and people who work in the helping professions. They can be withdrawn and dissociative. Remember, I showed you the nervous system kind of line at the bottom. If your body has been on high alert for so long, but there's nothing you can do to change with your situation, you stop tuning out to your warning signs, and you dissociate. And when people dissociate, what you can see, one of the kind of symptoms of dissociation is something called maladaptive daydreaming. So escaping from your reality by kind of engaging in fantasy. So especially with kids who are kind of already a little bit tricky with fantasy and reality, and it can kind of show up as lying and manipulation. You know, my dad's a superhero or whatever. And you can still get that in grown-ups too. Disrupted eating and sleeping, and we all know that if they're disrupted, you know, our well-being suffers anyway. And ineffective self-regulation, so kind of trying to numb the emotional pain, you know, sitting in that kind of high state, that heightened state, or that dissociated state, by self-harm, substance misuse, becoming overly independent, especially that with an avoidant attachment style. I'm going to touch on attachment in a second, but you know, if you've learned over time that your needs are never going to be met by another human being, you become avoidant in your attachment style, become overly independent. And overachieving and perfectionism, and now particularly on the rise at the moment, because we start to measure our self-worth by our productivity. And then externalize. So this is what you kind of, when you think about trauma, this is what, if I asked you to explain a trauma-based behavior, it might be, you know, anxiety, confrontational, controlling, explosive outbursts due to extreme emotional dysregulation, refusal or avoidance, difficulty separating from people that you're not sure whether they're going to be there when you come back again, agitated, avoiding situations that make you feel threatened, because a lot of your time is already spent taken up on kind of survival mode, so you don't want to do anything that gives you a bigger sense of risk or threat. And controlling or manipulative, because, you know, if you control your environment, there are no nasty surprises. So trauma can look like a number of things, and I think we just need to remember that there is no one traumatic presentation for any one person, and they can change over time, but these are some of the things to be aware of. Essentially, what we need to be doing is looking deeper, because what we see on the surface is not the whole story, and adaptive survival responses can look maladaptive in a different context. So what supported you here and what you need for here are very different. They're going to look very different. It's going to look maladaptive. Now, the other thing that we need to think about when we speak about trauma is core beliefs. So trauma, or being experienced a lot of trauma, complex and repetitive trauma, especially in the early years, can lay down some really funky core beliefs. And core beliefs are the things that we believe about ourselves based on the way we're treated. So, you know, if your needs have not been met, your emotional needs have not been met, you can start to believe that fundamentally you are unworthy or unlovable. And what that means is that you're not going to take the opportunity for the other relationships that might make you flourish and give you vitality, because you don't believe yourself to be worthy of them. So you deprive yourself of those. You can believe that vulnerability is dangerous, because if you are vulnerable, then attacks can come from anywhere. So you spend a lot of time trying to make yourself kind of strong. You can believe that others are scary and unpredictable. So if you've had unpredictable caregivers, or if you have come from a relationship there's been lots of kind of manipulation or emotional abuse, you can start to generalize that to other people, which can be very isolating and make us feel very threatened, and our nervous system becomes out of whack. And we start essentially believing that everyone or everything is a potential threat, and we become wired for protection, not connection. The other thing to think about when it comes to trauma is shame. So shame is there from an evolutionary perspective to make sure that we don't act outside of the needs of the pack. You know, we're social creatures. We thrive best when we're in packs. Now, shame, the evolutionary purpose is to make sure that our behaviour doesn't go too far out of societal norms. However, when you have grown up in an environment that's outside of your control, and you believe that you're unworthy and you're unlovable, and you haven't had your emotional needs met well, you believe that you are wrong. You get a sense of toxic shame. And toxic shame is painful, isolating, and disconnecting. It makes you defensive because you become shame defensive rather than shame tolerant. You don't want to go and put yourself in a situation where you may be criticised or judged because you're already feeling ashamed of yourself. You don't want anyone to touch that button. It's basically debilitating, and it actually triggers pain centres in the brain. You know yourself, if I asked you to reflect quickly on the last time you felt ashamed, it's an awful feeling. And I would see all the bodies on the cameras start doing this as they remembered that, because it's a horrible feeling. And shame triggers the default mode network, which is the ruminatory part of the brain where our negativity bias lives. So the more we feel ashamed, the more we kind of see the negative. The more we see the negative, the more likely we are to see the negative. It becomes a vicious cycle. Now, I just wanted to touch on empathy versus codependency, because lots of us in the helping professions come to the helping professions because a lot of us had maladaptive childhoods, and it's been like a way to kind of work through that. You know, we become helpers, and part of helping ourselves is helping others, and that becomes part of our healing process. A lot of people kind of talk about being empathetic, but there's a very big crossover between empathy and codependency. So empathy, true empathy for others, is being able to connect with others and the emotional experience of another person whilst holding your own experiences, which may differ from theirs, and be okay with that. It's not taking the other person's feelings on as your own, but being able to recognise another's feelings and not taking responsibility or accountability from them. Essentially comes from a secure base model that all feelings are okay and normal. Codependency is a belief that big feelings are dangerous, a fundamental belief that big feelings are dangerous and can't be tolerated, so therefore must be managed at all costs. So for me to be okay, you need to be okay. So I need to make you okay, so I'm okay. It's not coming from I can see you're in pain and you're suffering, I'd like to do as much as I can to help whilst holding my own reality. It's enmeshing the two experiences. So it's very important to think about that, because we can slip along that spectrum at the bottom at any given time, but we need to just be aware of that for ourselves and be mindful of that for others too. What is the purpose of what am I doing? What is the purpose of me and my role in this situation? Essentially, our job as leaders is to be brain architects and provide relational safety, not for children and young people, but also the people that we work with. You know, we need to be human for our humans. We need to learn to spot trauma code, understand it, and support people to rewrite it. We need to see when people's brains are written for an unhealthy environment to help them rewrite that maladaptive code for a healthy environment. And we do this by identifying risk factors for trauma and trauma responses through what we know from the research and the evidence, what we feel within ourselves. Ourselves are an amazing tool. Those mirror neurons, again, are amazing as long as we're coming from an empathetic rather than codependent standpoint. And what we observe from those we work with, from those we work with. So if you think about those two lists of internalized and externalized behaviors. So the first thing that we need to do as a leader when we're working with other people is own our own stuff. When we know our own stuff, we are better prepared to help others think about theirs, because it takes a calm brain to calm a brain. If we want to move towards a trauma-informed society, one that enables everybody's flourishing, we need to start small on a macro level. We can think about the policies that we do, but ultimately it all comes down to relationships and connections. And it takes a calm brain to calm a brain. So if we are in charge of our own stuff and we know when we get triggered, we can model good regulation. We can help co-regulate other people. We need to know, as a leader, when our own childhood story enters the room. And our childhood story is that kind of unhealed kind of part of ourselves, you know, those default pathways that were set up for a different situation that sometimes hoodwink us into behaving in a certain way in a high stakes environment. So we need to be really aware of what behaviours trigger us and understand why that is. We need to own our own stuff. That's the first thing that we need to do. The second thing that we need to do is build distress tolerance, because if we're wired for protection, not connection, if we have a high shame bucket and we know it's already full and we can't tolerate any more distress, so we'll explode or we'll avoid, we need to help people to develop distress tolerance. And distress tolerance is a person's ability to manage actual or perceived emotional distress. Remember, I talked about a negativity bias. The more you see or you experience something to be negative, the more you are likely to experience it to be negative. So it can be perceived emotional distress too. It also involves being able to make it through an emotional incident without making it worse. And I know lots of people get distressed and their childhood story enters the room and it makes the situation worse. So some distress tolerance strategies, and you will get a copy of these slides, are willing hands, half smile, and I use this one particularly a lot. These are biohacking kind of strategies. So willing hands are palms up, and half smile is like a Mona Lisa smile. And the reason that works when we're beginning to feel stressed out or distressed is because it is the opposite stance of a defensive stance. So when we're in a defense kind of attack, fight, flight kind of position, we're tense, we're kind of fists are up, and our jaw is tight. So if we can notice that's happening in ourselves and we have willing hands and half smile, we can have a chance of regulating ourselves and getting ourselves back into our window of tolerance. There's lots of different skills, tip skills, like changing temperature, moving our body, breathing. But we need to practice all of these distress tolerance skills when we are calm, because you can't teach a dysregulated brain regulation strategies. So as much as these are things that you pick and choose out when you're feeling dysregulated, you had to have learned them when you're regulated for them to work effectively. Also thinking about relationships, we need to think about how we place ourselves around other people. So this comes from Dan Hughes. So when we're showing up with people, if we can come from a position of light and openness, a loving position, and that can be professionally loving too. Acceptance, coming from a position, if somebody could have done something differently, they would have done, that curious and compassionate standpoint. Wondering what the meaning is behind a behaviour. Being empathetic means showing somebody that their inner life is important to you, and being boundaried and having some limits too, because a lot of the time when people have experienced trauma or they become very distressed, their boundaries can become very fuzzy. So limits are really containing to our brain. Another thing that we can do specifically as leaders is offer choice and control, because when people have experienced trauma or they're feeling very distressed, often trauma is an experience of extreme lack of choice and invalidation. And so if we can imagine that people need something different to what's gone before to cultivate an approach state of mind where they're curious and global and creative rather than an avoid state of mind, which is a threat state, we need to understand that people need these 5 things kind of recognized. So they need a sense of status, so sense of personal self-worth, so you see them for who they are, a sense of certainty, so knowing what's coming next so they can stay out of their emotional brain and be in their thinking brain, a sense of autonomy, so feeling like they've got some say over the proceedings, or a sense of relatedness, so feeling like they can trust you, and a sense of fairness, that you are generous in your assumptions of their behaviour, you've got their back. If you are interested in the SCARF model, I could talk for hours on that on its own. I will send a link out at the end, because it's really important, I think, about how to create safe environments for people to access their approach state of mind. One of the other big things that we need to do as leaders is be responsive. And being responsive means basically having a plan, but don't be afraid to change it to a backup plan if needed. And there's a difference between flexibility and inconsistency. Flexibility is setting out the expectation that you will be responsive and switch between plans when needed. Inconsistency is not having a plan for when things turn to custard. Flexibility helps to include people and helps them to feel safe. And inconsistency makes people feel unsafe. So we need to be very aware of the two. It's okay to chop and change as long as that was set up front. The difference is the intentionality. And now, for me personally, the holy trinity of trauma-informed approach when it comes to what we can do as individuals are the holy trinity of self-compassion, which is the antidote to shame, mindfulness, so we can notice when our childhood story enters the room, and we can notice our emotional cues early enough before they overwhelm us and kind of flip us into our fight, flight, freeze functions, and strengths and values. So self-compassion is essentially not over-identifying with our I'm crap stories, really, and having a script to flip that on its head. So my I'm crap story was always like, oh, you silly cow, you've stuffed that right up. And I've changed that to, that was unlike me. Next time I'll try better. And that changes the way that I feel about myself. That absolutely makes me feel more like I can do something rather than feel ashamed of myself. And that gets me in my approach state of mind rather than my avoid state of mind. Mindfulness is really good for kind of noticing your triggers and being able to calm yourself down when your nervous system flares, when you kind of get into either the top kind of sympathetic nervous system state of mind. So recognizing where you are in your window of tolerance and kind of re-regulating yourself. But for me, the really important thing is having a key understanding of what your strengths and values are, not just your personal strengths and values, but also your organizational or your systemic strengths and values too, because those are the compass for a meaningful life. So if we can talk to ourselves and calm ourselves down with self-compassion and be like gentle on ourselves when things don't go as expected, if we can check in with ourselves and make sure that we can feel, that we can build on our sense of interoception, so we notice when we're triggered, so we're less likely to be hoodwinked by those triggers and be responsive rather than reactive. Strengths and values are the compass that we go back to that intentionally direct our behaviour, even when things get tricky. And finally, intentionally build a sense of belonging, connection, and community engagement, going back to the fact that we are social beings. If we are going to build a trauma-informed society, then we need to make people feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves in a positive manner. And there's lots of things that you can do for this. And I'm kind of talking about the small things that you can do. So you're thinking about the confluence between things that matter and things that are within your control. These are intentional small acts that make a big difference. So random acts of kindness, roles of responsibility and volunteering projects, meeting with your people in your place, making sure that you feel connected. Trauma makes you feel disconnected. It wires you for self-protection. It robs you of the vitality that relationships can bring to your life. If you can overcome that by slowly but surely build a sense of safety through belonging, connection, you can rewire the brain for connection, which does give you that sense of vitality back in your life. And I guess for me, overall, the biggest thing to think about when you think about trauma-informed societies is that we need to create a sense of safety for people to think about, overcome that shame, so become shame tolerant rather than shame defensive. If people can feel safe enough to feel, they're going to be brave enough to heal. So safety first, connection first, thinking about how do we understand how or why our brain was wired in terms of traumatic experiences, how a nervous system was set up in relation to traumatic experiences, and how we can teach people to be safe enough to feel their emotions so they can learn how to heal their emotions. Now, I would like to kind of pose you some questions as leaders. A trauma-informed approach, from my perspective, benefits everybody and detracts from nobody. And trauma-informed, just to me, means human-centric and nervous system friendly. What do humans actually need from an evolutionary perspective to be well? Where has society gone wrong? Not just in terms of, early adversity and adverse childhood experiences, but what do we keep doing in society in the way that we show up that traumatizes? If you think about that fourth R, resist re-traumatization. And remember, ultimately, the thing that is within your control is connection and safety, generosity in your assumptions. Trauma is not damage. It is a healthy adaptation to a maladaptive environment. You don't have to enable problematic behavior to understand why it exists and do something to help somebody change that behavior. There's a big difference between empathy and enabling. And if you think about codependency and empathy, that's a good place to start. So what time are we on, Greg?
We're about 2 minutes past 5.
Okay, so I would like you to ask yourselves as a leader, when you go away from today, there was a huge amount of information, and I'm notorious at trying to get too much information into a short space of time. But as a leader, just ask yourself, in terms of a trauma-informed approach in your life, in your sphere of influence, what would your ideal be? What strengths do you already have, and how will you grow these? What else do you need? And where will you go to get this? Because this is not a singular pursuit. If you think about those tiny molecules in the wave to make the movement, we all need to come together in the same way. But thank you very much. If you are interested in any of the links or any of the research that I've talked about today, you can get hold of me just there.